All right, so good evening, everyone. Tonight we're going to be discussing Chapter 4, States of Consciousness. And remember that this is being recorded and that please feel free to ask questions. But if you do not want your voice broadcast on YouTube, you may type your questions in the chat. I will read them out loud and for the benefit of all students and answer the question to the best of my ability. So with that, here we go. Chapter 4, States of Consciousness. So the first thing we need to really discuss is what is consciousness, right? So right now, everyone in class, including me, hopefully, are conscious, right? In other words, I'm aware of internal and external stimuli, right? Such as, feelings, hunger, pain, detection of light as I look around my home. By the way, welcome to my home. So in other words, I am here. I'm aware. When I am working with clients, right? That's one of the things that I'm looking for. What is their state of consciousness? What's their level of orientation, right? Are they alert? Are they wakeful? That's another thing, right? So wakefulness is high levels of sensory awareness, thought, behavior, right? So as you participate in this class, assuming that I am not too boring, I will help to maintain your wakefulness and your awareness and thought and behavior. So, and then of course, sleep, which we all experience, is a quiet and mysterious pause in our daily activity. And we're going to be talking about sleep to start off with tonight with states of consciousness. So another thing that is addressed in this chapter is biological rhythms. And I think one of the most famous biological rhythm that everybody knows, or most people know, is the circadian rhythm, right? And that is the biological rhythm that basically occurs over a 24-hour period, right? And it's generated by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN. So you can say SCN for short, because sometimes those big long words, I do know they can be difficult. Sometimes I even trip over them. And it also manages the sleep-wake cycle, right? Is one of our main circadian rhythms. And that is linked to the elements of natural light and darkness, right? And so we'll talk about how serotonin is impacted by light versus darkness. But in general, a biological, sorry, I tripped over my tongue. Biological rhythm is an internal cycle of biological activity, right? So when you think of hunger, that is part of your biological rhythm. Your levels of alertness, a menstrual cycle is a biological rhythm. Fluctuations in your body temperature. It is quite normal for your body temperature to fluctuate during the day. What's interesting with the recent COVID-19 situation, which we are all still being impacted, obviously, as evidenced by not being able to meet in person for this course. But one of the things is there's been a lot of temperatures being taken. That's a lot of data points. And I read an article late last year that talked about the 98.6, which has been standard for people. It now appears that we're actually, on average, have an average lower body temperature than that, right? So it's just kind of interesting, but that is part of your biological rhythm, that internal cycle. And then what is it that controls our biological rhythms, right? And so that would be the hypothalamus. You'll see that later on. You'll actually see the suprachiasmatic nucleus as well later on when we're looking at pictures of the brain. And then this is a chart from the book that basically demonstrates the circadian rhythm or the change in body temperature over 28 hours for it says here 8 young men. So they put all these data points together. And so you'll notice here, there's some data points that are slightly above 98.6, but they drop down as far as 97 point, let's just say somewhere in the 97.6 range or 97.55 range, right? So you can see that that rhythm fluctuates throughout the day, and that is normal. All right, so let's talk about the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So these are all the things that are involved with that, right? So light is a major trigger for this, and this is located, excuse me, sorry, in the hypothalamus, and it basically serves as your brain's clock mechanism, and it sets itself with light information received through the projections of the retina. And what this does is this allows your brain, it allows it to sync with the outside world. You may be asked a question about the hypothalamus. I don't believe I have anything on the pituitary gland or the pineal gland. I just kind of want you to understand the basic of it. You won't have to know exactly where it's located in the brain or anything like that. I used to do a pop quiz that in class, if we were in class, you would probably get it. Where I'd put out a piece of paper with a brain on it and ask for some basic structures, but you guys are being spared that this semester. But on the exam, I don't have anything like this. So I don't want you to concern yourself too much about this. I do want you to understand the basic purpose of the hypothalamus and the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the SCN. Any questions so far? You can type it in the chat or you can shout it out. I don't see any, so just let me know, just stop me if you need to. All right, so now we're gonna move into like melatonin and sleep regulation. And so remember earlier, before that, we were talking about how light helps reset our brain's clock, right? And so melatonin is one of those examples of that. So melatonin is released when it gets dark. So it's stimulated by darkness, and it's designed to make us sleepy. And when it becomes daylight, then melatonin is inhibited. So going back to last chapter, if you'll recall, when we were talking about excitatory and inhibitory neuronal function. So your melatonin neurons are being inhibited by light in this particular case. And then, of course, sleep regulation is the brain's control of switching between sleep and wakefulness, as well as coordinating the cycle with the outside world. And again, that's mainly based on light and darkness, right? And resetting that clock. However, I do want to point out that each person, let me turn on my laser pointer so you can see, because I'm kind of like focused on here, right? Each person has an individual pattern of activity known as a person's chronotype, right? So for example, the very first, so this class, on the first day of class, this module, Canvas course, was available at midnight. And oh, I'm not talking to you, Siri. At midnight. And at 1:38 in the morning, one of you late night owls was up checking out my course. And then there was another student, right, who was up really early in the morning. I believe it was like 5:30-ish. that was on the Canvas site, checking out things, right? And so I'm using that as an example because obviously one person's chronotype is they tend to like to be a night owl. Another person's chronotype is they're an early riser, right? So just an interesting fact. I think I even sent out an email about that for you guys. I know I'll have a late night one. I was right. All right, so now let's talk about some disruptions to sleep, right? So what disrupts our normal sleep? A couple of things that are mentioned in the book. One thing that I'm going to highlight first, I know it's out of order on the slide, is rotating shift work, right? So a work schedule that changes from early to late on a daily basis can really impact a person's ability for their normal circadian rhythm to be maintained, right? And what it can do is it can result in persistent feelings of exhaustion. People might be short with you, maybe a little rude. They're agitated. It can also, sleep problems can also lead to signs of depression and anxiety as well, right? So sleep disturbance can do that. Using a bright light can be used to realign your biological clock with the external environment. So I know some people like work like the midnight shift or the third shift, right? From 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. or midnight to 8. That can, even just doing that can throw off your biological rhythm, right? So if you work in a 24-hour facility, like back in the day, I used to be a casino manager way back in the day, and I did third shift, and so you sleep during the day and be up at night, and that kind of throws you off. The other thing is jet lag, and so jet lag is symptoms resulting from the mismatch between our internal circadian rhythms and our environment. So if I get on a plane and I fly 5 hours east, right, to the East Coast, I will probably experience some jet lag. Why? Because I'm used to, my rhythm here. I get back there and the time period might be 3 hours off. It's even worse if you have flown halfway across the globe, which I have done as well. And anybody in here that's done it can probably testify to that, especially if you spend 24 hours on a plane flying from LAX to Indonesia. That's quite a long trip. So, all right. Looks like we have a question. Let me turn off my laser pointer so that it will work right. And yeah, so someone is sharing, started off strong this month, waking up early, getting everything done until the end of the month when I begin to feel exhausted and anxiety, which caused stress, right? And that's and that is another thing, right? And then that begins to affect our sleep, right? So one of the things that when I'm working, thank you for sharing that. One of the things when I'm working with my clients is working on sleep hygiene, and sleep hygiene is very important for helping people to get to a normal sleep routine. And so, for example, one of the things I tell my clients if they're having trouble sleeping is, first of all, making sure that in your bedroom, no TV. When you're laying in bed, bed is only for two things and two things only: sleep and sex. And if you're doing anything else other than sleeping or having sex in bed, then what you're doing is you're cueing your body, right? And we'll learn about this when we talk about Pavlov's dogs and classical conditioning, but you're cueing your body to not go to sleep because you're used to doing other activities in bed, playing on your phone, playing video games, watching TV. All of that stuff can impact your sleep hygiene. So if there's issues with that, maybe consider a sleep hygiene plan. So why is sleep deprivation bad, right? This is what we talk about. We've already kind of talked about, anxiety, depression, irritability, those kinds of things, which impact our interactions with other people, correct? And so that can also result in more issues. But there's a couple things we want to talk about here, right? So the first thing is a concept known as sleep debt, right? And sleep debt is the result of insufficient sleep on a chronic basis. So if you're going and you're getting, 4 hours sleep, 5 hours sleep, 2 hours sleep, and this is, uh, consistent days, you're actually in sleep debt. You're not getting enough sleep. You're not being um, uh, refreshed and rested, which is really important. And then there's sleep rebound, and that is a sleep deprived individual will tend to take a shorter time to fall asleep during subsequent opportunities to sleep. Some other issues with sleep deprivation, and here we have the outline of a human body, and and it's pointing to different areas, right? So we talked about some of this, right? Irritability. Something I hadn't talked about yet, but I'm going to mention now, is sleep deprivation also leads to cognitive impairment. In other words, you just don't sleep as well. Sorry, you just don't think as well. I misspoke. So you don't think as well. There's memory lapses, and you can actually experience memory loss. So let's just talk about the upcoming exam. One of the things that I talk to students about when it comes to the exam is cramming is not the best way to take an exam. One, you often will deprive yourself of sleep in order to cram, which is already putting you at risk at cognitive impairment, memory lapses, right? And so you may not do as well. So that's why it's always better to pace yourself throughout a course, right? Do the readings in such a manner that you're able to do them and take them in, do the homework in such a way that you can do them and take them in, and then not have to cram and rush everything the last weekend, because you just set yourself up, right? So I always take a moment when we're talking about sleep deprivation and hit and say that. Some other issues would be like impaired moral judgment. People can actually experience hallucinations. You can experience symptoms that may resemble or mimic ADHD, or adult deficit and hyperactivity, right? So it can mimic that. Sleep can also impact your immune system. It can actually lower your immune response, uh, increases your risk for diabetes. Um, there's increased heart rate variability. Uh, your muscle memory will suffer from that. You'll have increased reaction time. So in other words, it's going to take you longer to react to something. So if you're driving in a car and you're sleep deprived, your reaction time is actually going to be longer, which may cause you to have a fender bender, right? All right, hold on one second. Sorry, a couple people in the waiting room. Let them in, and we're back. So these are some of the things that sleep deprivation um, can cause an impact. Are there any questions to this point? All right. So what is sleep? So sleep is, I know this sounds like an obvious question and answer, but it's marked by relatively low physical activity, right? You're definitely experiencing a reduced sense of awareness. Um, and the other thing about sleep is that the sleep-wake cycles are controlled by multiple brain areas. So it's not just one necessarily brain area that does it. Earlier, we were talking about the supra chiasmatic nucleus, the SCN, the hypothalamus. Now we're talking about the thalamus, you'll notice here, and the pons, which impacts or has is connected to REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. And sleep is associated with the secretion and regulation of hormones, the most famous being melatonin, which we've already talked about, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and growth hormone, which is, I did forget to mention, down here on this diagram, it also shows that growth suppression can be associated with sleep deprivation, right? Risk of obesity, that kind of stuff. And that's because of the growth hormone. And so, and then this is from your book here. It just shows the different wavelengths for the physical variables, what's going on during sleep. And let's see, it looks like we have a question. Let me turn off my laser pointer, go back up to that. Yes, so one of your fellow students is making a comment stating that when I was deployed, by the way, thank you very much for your service. I wanted to say oorah, but sorry, former Marine here. But when I was deployed on a ship, we worked 12-hour shifts, and my coworkers used melatonin. Never worked for me. Do you know why that may be possible? So that's a really good question. And here's what I don't know. What I'm going to relay in answer to your question, and it won't answer it directly because I don't know, is that what I have understood, and I've been like looking for some studies just to see if there's any real veracity to this, but people using melatonin a lot, right, may be impacting that production in the brain. Now, it's just an educated guess on my part. I don't really have any, like I said, I tried to look for some research articles. What I'm basing this educated guess on is based on my understanding of addiction. And so what happens with addiction is, for instance, dopamine will get used up in addiction and it won't produce, you won't produce enough dopamine, as an example, right? Because it's being impacted by a substance being introduced into the brain. So if I had to take a guess, melatonin, if you're taking too much of that, it may be having the same impact. But the best way to get that answer would be, if you're having sleep problems, really to consult your doctor on that. And is melatonin the best thing? The other thing is, what's the quality control on the melatonin you were taking? Is it made by, so some of the stuff you can buy over the counter, are you really getting what you're paying for, right? And if you watch TV and you look at these commercials, it'll say like not FDA approved. And what that means is nobody's really looking at it for quality control that much, right? So let's see. I just finished working in a pharmacy. Oh, maybe we have an answer here. I just finished working in a pharmacy for 6 years, and the clinical efficacy of melatonin is low because it is usually effective in small doses, but clinical evidence for larger doses isn't great, which is exactly, yes, thank you. Because I've tried to find this, and that's exactly what I was thinking as well. So thank you for confirming my somewhat educated guess on that. People with sleep apnea are also in this category. Yes, and sleep apnea, we are about to talk about in a slide or two. So you guys are, you know what? This class is just awesome. You guys are engaged. And I know the difficulty with Zoom. So I just want to just say I really appreciate this. So you guys are doing great. All right, so here's the brain areas. We've already seen some of this already before. And like I said, I'm not really going to test you like I might if we were actually in class, but I do want you to understand about the thalamus and the hypothalamus and the suprachiasmatic nucleus and the pituitary gland and the pons. And we've also talked about these in previous chapters. So this is one of those examples where, yes, the tests aren't, the stuff isn't necessarily cumulative, but there will be repeated episodes in the semester. And this is one of those examples. All right. All right, so why do we sleep? So there's a couple things to address. So one is the adaptive function, which is an evolutionary hypothesis. And what that says is that sleep is essential in order to restore resources that are expended through the day. And that sleep is an adaptive response to predatory risks, which increase in darkness, right? So there is little evidence to support these explanations. And again, you'll notice that it says, let me turn on my laser pointer, hypothesis. So remember the difference between a theory, which is a well-developed set of ideas based in evidence and researched, right? Whereas a hypothesis is actually going to be what is being researched, right? So if we're only stuck with the hypothesis and there's no evidence behind it, just remember, don't confuse theory and hypothesis. Cognitive function, this is another area. So focuses on sleep's importance for cognitive function and memory formation. So research shows that sleep deprivation results in disruptions in cognition and memory deficits, and that these impairments become more severe as the amount of sleep deprivation increases. So the more sleep you lose, the worse your cognitive function gets. And then slow wave sleep appears to be essential for effective memory formation, right? And we're going to talk about dreaming here in a minute. And it looks like another question has come in. Oh yes, people take siestas in Spain. Yeah, and that's another. And I don't have any evidence, but it does bring up some anecdotal things that we hear, right? That short naps during the day can be helpful. That if your nap is too long, right? Now, I have not personally done research on that. That's why I am labeling it anecdotal at this point. Remember, the difference between anecdotal and empirical is empirical has evidence and research behind it. That statement, an empirical statement, it has research and evidence behind it. My anecdotal statement regarding naps and siestas is just that. It's like, this is what I've heard, this is what I've seen, but I don't have the research on that. And the culture of siestas is interesting too. So what are some benefits of sleep? Maintaining healthy weight is one benefit. Lowering stress levels, improving mood. Your motor coordination is increased. And getting back to cognition and memory, that is also improved. All right, so there are I'm sorry, misspoke. 5 stages of sleep, and we're going to talk a little bit about each one over the next several slides. So first, let's hit some brain waves. So brainwave activity, and I think a lot of people already know this, but changes dramatically across different stages of sleep, right? So you have alpha waves, which are very low frequency, relatively high amplitude and synchronized uh, waves. And then you have theta waves. So if you look at this chart, let me put on my laser pointer. So this is awake, right? This is awake consciousness, right? Stage one, or non-REM sleep, this is your alpha waves. And this also is in the book too. And then your non-REM stage two theta rays, waves, sorry, not rays, waves, are low frequency, low amplitude waves. But then this is also where you will experience these sleep spindles that I know you read about, and K complexes. And then stages 3 and 4 are also non-REM, and these are known as delta waves. And these are low frequency, high amplitude, and not synchronized. And you can see the difference. So synchronized, right, tends to be a little more of a pattern to it. The desynchronized is a little bit more, the pattern is much more difficult to discern. So that's the difference between the synchronized and the desynchronized. And then REM, or rapid eye movement sleep, is demonstrated down here at the bottom. It's interesting because it's almost, but not quite, almost looks like alpha. All right. So stage one is the transitional phase between wakefulness and sleep. This is when your respiration will begin to slow down. This is when your heartbeat will slow down. Your core body temperature will decrease. Your muscle tension basically decreases, right? You're becoming relaxed, in other words. And then this is where alpha waves occur. Then moving from stage one into stage two, your body is now going into deep relaxation. This is where the theta waves are. And it's also characterized by the appearance of the sleep spindle, which is demonstrated here, pictured here, and the K complex, which is demonstrated on the right side. And what a sleep spindle is, it's a rapid burst of high frequency brain waves, and you can see that. And then the K complexes are very high amplitude brain activity. So frequency is measured across, amplitude is measured from top to bottom. So for those that are wondering, what's he talking about, amplitude and frequency? Stages 3 and 4 are slow wave sleep. This is where your delta waves appear. Here it's demonstrated by the reddish, brownish, orangish line here. And then this is also a measurement of delta waves in that. And next we'll move into rapid eye movement. This is the one where people, I think a lot of you students know this already. You know, if you watch somebody sleeping, not to be a creep, but sorry, but if you see somebody sleeping, if you're conducting an experiment on sleep and you see a person's eyes darting back and forth underneath their eyelids, you can see their eyes moving. That is a person that is experiencing rapid eye movements. During rapid eye movement sleep, or REM sleep, your body naturally will paralyze your voluntary muscles. In other words, you become kind of frozen. This is where dreams occur, and the brain waves are similar to those seen in in wakefulness. I actually misspoke earlier. I said it's kind of like alpha waves, but it's more similar to wakefulness. So I want to correct my misspeaking from before, which is very interesting, right? And so many people will remember their dreams, some people won't, and we're going to talk about dreams here too. But one of the things that's really interesting about rapid eye movement is the idea behind it is that your brain is consolidating memories and events, and doing some kind of processing behind there. One of the things that, as a therapist, that I have been trained in is EMDR, which is eye movement and desensitization and reprocessing, right? Which is which uses the bilateral stimulation of eye movements to replicate REM sleep, but only for longer periods of time during wakefulness. So it's really interesting. I really like doing EMDR, and but it has its basis in reprocessing. Works really well with trauma, and it works really well with addiction as well. So that's kind of where that came from. One of the theories behind that. And we have a question. Let's see. Wow. Okay. Interesting. So not sharing the student's name, but talking about a relative that was having seizures. And then one of the things that the doctor did was to have him wear basically conduct an EEG test for 24 hours. And then it was realized during this person's sleep that they were also having seizures. So very interesting, very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And then the link for the bilateral study, that's one of those things that you can, I don't have a particular link, but there's lots of research on it. I'll bet if you go to the library, the databases that I showed you on how to do your research for your research paper, you will find plenty on EMDR. So, and you can always send me an email and we can meet offline to go deeper into that if you'd like. All right. Let's see here. Hold on. Sorry, I got to turn off my pen because my pointer isn't working right. All right. So here is a hypnogram that kind of demonstrates your sleep cycle. And you'll notice, so along this axis, right, it says awake, REM sleep stages 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you'll notice that from awake, it goes down and then it will go back up and then down and back up. And I don't know if anybody here tracks their sleep. I actually do because I'm kind of a nerd and a geek in that way. And I get a graphic display that shows my sleep. What's interesting though, I'll be honest, is I don't know how accurate it is. I just do it because I'm kind of a geek in that way. But it often does resemble this, although I usually only get about 7 hours of sleep. So if you ever have time and want to play with something like that, it's kind of interesting, kind of cool. All right. Any questions before we move into dreams? All right. So when it comes to dreams, you know, there are two people specifically, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, that really addressed dreams, right? And so Freud, he saw dreams as a way to gain access to the unconscious. And he actually looked at dreams as uh, that people's dreams were like insight into their unconscious. And there was two different types of content that he had, right? So there's manifest content, which is the actual content of the dream, right? So what happened, who was chasing who, what was going on, right? What actually happened in the dream. And then the second part, the other content that he would talk about is what's known as latent content. And what latent content was the hidden meaning um, behind the dream. So I'm going to use an example, and I hope I don't offend anybody with this. So just bear with me because I'm using this example as Freud would use it, and I will tell you, Freud uh, he related everything to phallics and to sexual desire, right? So if a woman, and I'm going to use it as a woman because he was also, oh gosh, I'm being recorded. I'll probably get in trouble for saying this. He was a little bit sexist, I think, when you look at some of his work. But he focused on women a lot. But if a woman had a dream that she was being chased by a snake, that was the manifest content. That's what happened in the dream. And Freud would say that the hidden meaning behind that was that the snake represented a penis, and her running away from it is really the hidden meaning is her own fear of sexual intimacy. And that's how he would interpret it, right? And so I'm using that example from Freud um, to demonstrate manifest content and latent content. It's a very oversimplified um, uh, explanation. However, knowing what I know about what I've learned about Freud, everything was tied to sex, right? Um, and Carl Jung believed that dreams allowed us to tap into what he called the collective unconscious. And for him, the collective unconscious was basically a repository of information that we all share, regardless of our culture, right? Um, and he believed that certain symbols in dreams reflected certain universal archetypes, like the hero, for example, right? And so he believed in this collective unconscious that all human beings share, regardless of their culture. There's a lot of cross-cultural similarities, he would say. And it looks like we have a question here. So let's see. Okay, thank you for letting me know. All right. So what research says is that dreams may represent life events that are important to the dreamer. They also may represent a state of proto-consciousness or a virtual reality in the mind that helps the person during consciousness. And then there are lucid dreams where certain aspects of wakefulness are maintained during a dreaming state, and a person becomes aware that they are dreaming. So some of the theories on dreaming. Any questions? Any questions on manifest versus latent content or the collective unconscious? I know you can expect to see this in the homework, and you will also see similar questions on the exam regarding these.
So, Professor, it is normal that sometimes we remember our dreams and sometimes not?
Yes, that is normal as far as I know. Yeah. It's funny. I've talked to people in the past that said, well, I never dream. I'm like, well, I don't know that that's true. I think everybody dreams. You just may not remember it, right? So, but yes, that is normal. All right. So insomnia. So insomnia is defined by having difficulty either falling asleep, like you lay in bed and you toss and turn for a while and you just cannot fall asleep, or if you fall asleep, you're not able to maintain sleep. So you wake up um, uh, throughout the night, right? And it's not a restful sleep. And and that this occurs for at least 3 nights a week for 1 month's time. So in order to be able to be diagnosed with insomnia, it has to occur at least 3 nights a week or 12 times in a month is basically what we're talking about, right? Um, Insomnia every once in a while is, the inability to fall asleep or stay asleep can be part of a normal person's, thing. But if you're having this frequently, then you may have a sleep disorder that you might want to have checked out, right? Um, and oh, there's a typo here. May be associated with symptoms of depression as well, right? So sleep disturbance is one of those things that when I'm assessing someone for depression or anxiety also, is how is your sleep, right? And if it's disturbed, they're experiencing insomnia, or if they're experiencing hypersomnia, that may also um, be indicative of depression as well. So it looks like we have a question. Deja vu. That is coming back. I think I have that on another slide. But deja vu um, is probably from a dream or a prior memory that just may not be fully remembered. Like, ooh, I think I've done this before. Um, but yeah, it could be a weird feeling too. We're going to hit that here in just a second. So other contributing factors to insomnia might be age, drug use, right? So if you're using methamphetamine, you won't sleep for days. Exercise. So if you're doing that, so remember earlier I was talking about sleep hygiene. So exercising right before you go to bed may not be helpful, right? Might key you up. It just depends. Your mental status, right? So if you're worried, experiencing some anxiety, have a lot of things going on your mind, have a lot of things on your mind. And then bedtime routines, right? So remember what I said the bed is used for? Only two things, right? Sleep and sex. You're doing anything else around that or doing any other routines that cues your body to be more alert, that could interrupt or cause issues with sleep. Some treatment for insomnia is stress management techniques. Also, interestingly, cognitive behavioral therapy, which focuses on cognitive problem processes and certain problem behaviors, has been shown to assist with insomnia as well. All right, so parasomnia involves unwanted motor behavior or experiences that occur during the sleep cycle, right? So one example is sleepwalking. And this usually occurs during slow wave sleep. REM sleep behavior disorder occurs when the muscle paralysis that normally occurs does not occur. And so there might be some high levels of physical activity that occur during REM sleep. And this can be treated with anti-anxiety medication, right? So then there's restless leg syndrome that can also be associated with, uncomfortable sensations in the legs, right? You're trying to go to sleep and your legs just don't want to stop, right? And there's some medications that can treat that. So you would need to see your doctor. And then night terrors. So a night terror is where the person sleeping, experiences a sense of panic and may scream, yell out. It can be very loud, can scare other people that, may be around, try to escape. And these occur during non-REM sleep. And then somebody earlier asked about sleep apnea. So here is sleep apnea, right? So that occurs when individuals stop breathing during their sleep. And it usually occurs for 10 to 20 seconds or longer. The issue is that the repeated disruptions lead to increased levels of fatigue. And it can be common for people who are overweight. And there are two types. There's the obstructive sleep apnea, and that's where the airway is being blocked and air is being prevented from entering the lungs. So that's one. And then there's the central sleep apnea, where the central nervous system itself fails to initiate breaths. Treatment can include CPAP device, which actually pumps air directly, into the person's airways. So that's how that gets treated. And we have a question. So a question about if a person is crying in their sleep, is that a part of that? And I'm wondering if we're talking about the parasomnias, right? Could be. I'm not sure that I'm qualified to answer that question, but it could be something related here. My recommendation would be to speak to a physician about that, and they may do a referral to a sleep expert. You know, they do sleep studies and all kinds of stuff, so might be able to find some answers. All right, let's see here. And then sadly, we also need to kind of address SIDS, right? Sudden infant death syndrome, which, you know, horrible. This occurs when the infant stops breathing during sleep, and as a result, the infant, you know, passes away, right? They die. Infants less than a year are at the highest risk, and boys seem to have a greater risk than girls. And so some contributing factors that have been identified are things such as premature birth, smoking within the home, and then hyperthermia, which is cold. So, and then of course there's the Sleep Safe or Safe to Sleep campaign, right? That educates the public on how to minimize the risk factors associated with SIDS. And I do know that's a homework question. You may see this on the exam as well. And then there's narcolepsy. And this is the irresistible urge to fall asleep during wake hours, right? And it's often triggered by states of heightened arousal or stress. And then the person that experiences this shares many features of REM sleep, including the loss of muscle tone while awake, right? So remember that sleep paralysis that we were talking about, and then hallucinations, right? The vivid, dreamlike hallucinations. And the way that gets treated is with psychomotor stimulant drugs. So there is treatment for that. So if that's a person can get help for that. I'm trying to think of the name of the movie. There was a movie about a guy. It's an old one. It's not really important, but it just came to my head, where he would just fall asleep in the middle of the day. All right, so let's do this. It is 19:01 hours for civilians out there. That's 7:01 p.m. So we're going to take a break. We'll come back. I'll give you guys until, I want to give you more than, so let's come back at 7:20 p.m. And then we'll move into substance use disorders. And I'm going to pause the recording here. And then we'll be back. So a minute ago, before we moved into this, we were talking about SIDS, and I had accidentally misspoke and said hyperthermia was cold. Remember, hyper is in excess or above the norm, and hypo means below the normal. So in this case, hypothermia would be increased temperature, right? So I misspoke earlier and I said the opposite. So my apologies. So I wanted to correct that. It's good when students point that out, right? So thank you very much, because sometimes I catch myself when I say something, I catch it, and then other times I don't, because I think I've said the right thing. So good job helping me out. All right. So now we're going to start discussing substance use disorders. And one of the things that is listed here that we're going to talk about is the difference between physiological dependence on a substance and psychological dependence on a substance, right? And so basically, the main definition for a substance use disorder in general is a compulsive pattern of drug use despite having negative consequences. And the book that's pictured here, excuse me, just 1 second. Sorry, I've been doing pretty good tonight without too much of a coughing fit. But that one came on, so I apologize. Anyway, as I was saying, so substance use disorder is a compulsive pattern of drug use despite having negative consequences, right? And so when I assess people for or diagnose them for a substance use disorder, there's 11 criteria for that I'm looking at, right? Part of that is any pharmacological indicators, which would include tolerance and withdrawal, right? So tolerance and withdrawal is associated with physiological dependence. And the reason for that is because in physiological dependence, the body actually changes in their normal body functions and experience withdrawal from the drug when when the drug is stopped, when they no longer are using the drug, putting it in their bodies. And then psychological dependence is the emotional need for the drug. So a person may go through withdrawal, may experience some cravings, but they're not really tissue dependent anymore. They've kind of, they're over the acute withdrawal part. And now it's the psychological dependence that that can be an issue, also leading to relapse into using a substance. So this chart kind of demonstrates, it's a kind of a complex sort of Venn diagram thing going on here, right? So there are several categories, and let me turn on my pen so we can kind of highlight them as I talk about it. So here's my laser pointer. So one class of drug that's kind of off by itself here are antipsychotics, right? And these are used to treat individuals that are experiencing symptoms of like schizophrenia, you know, they're having audio visual hallucinations, things like that. And so these are your antipsychotics. Usually not drugs of abuse, but they're important to mention because it is a category of drug. The main categories of drugs that we are going to talk about, and you'll also see there's some overlap with it, is are stimulants, depressants, and hallucinogenics. Okay, so the way drugs are categorized is based on what their effect is. So I'll give you an example. You ask a lot of people what type of a drug alcohol is, and well, I don't know. Somebody brave want to
It's a
shout out?
depressant.
Okay, it's a depressant. Any other guesses? Depressant is correct, by the way, but sometimes I hear other guesses. Don't be afraid. All right, I'll just say it. Sometimes people will say, well, it's a stimulant because, when I go out drinking, it makes me feel good. It has, um, uh, it gets me going, et cetera, et cetera. And alcohol is one of those drugs that can seem like a stimulant at times, but that's not how it's categorized. It's categorized by its effect on the central nervous system, what it does inside your body. And what it does is it actually depresses it, right? So that's how things are categorized. Your depressants are things like alcohol, barbiturates, GHB is a depressant, right? And then your stimulants, those are the drugs that actually rev up the central nervous system, right? They get you going. Those are your amphetamines, your caffeine, nicotine is in that category, cat, Ritalin. They're psychomotor stimulants, and they get the body going. And then hallucinogens is basically how it is affecting a person's perception for the most part, right? And so that's how the drugs are categorized. Any questions on that? You will see some questions on categorizing, but
marijuana is the hardest one to categorize. No, it's a little bit about everything. It's depressing.
Well, it's not it's more hallucinogenic than anything, right? It's not really a stimulant, right? So it's really, I would classify it more in the hallucinogenic type properties. Yeah. Now, if you sprinkle a little methamphetamine on your joint, you're going to get a little bit of both, right? You're going to get your stimulant effects, and you're going to get your dazed effect as well. Any other questions on? All right. All right, so we talked about homeostasis in the second chapter, and we touched on it again in the third chapter. And now in chapter 4, we're going to hit on it again. And homeostasis is really important in this particular case because the next term I'm going to teach you is what happens when homeostasis is dysregulated, right? And so homeostasis is the tendency for the body to seek and maintain a condition of balance, right? So I want you to think of like equilibrium. So it maintains your body temperature, it maintains your heart rate, it maintains your breathing, right? There's the body always wants to go to its normal set point, right? So simple example of that is the body's ability to maintain an internal temperature of 98.6 degrees, right? So earlier we talked about that it does fluctuate, but that is the accepted standard, right? 98.6. We don't go too hot, we don't go too cold. That's homeostasis. Right? Any questions on homeostasis? Oops. What happens when I click too fast? So once you introduce a stressor to an organism, right? that organism will respond to the stressor. And I'm going to use the example of drugs. Um, so homeostasis, right? So we have a body temperature of 98.6. Our breathing rate is a certain way, heart rate is a certain way, my neurotransmission is happening the way it normally does. And then I put methamphetamine into my system. And the body is going to react to the introduction of methamphetamine, right? So you're going to have increased neurotransmission, dopamine release. There's going to be a rush, that high. It's going to increase heart rate. Your pupils are going to get your eyes are going to look black. Your pupils will get so big, and and that's because methamphetamine is a psychoactive stimulant, and it has activated basically kind of like the fight or flight response in a way, right? It's activating those systems. So that's what happens if I take it one time, right? If I continue to take it, then my body will move to a new level of a norm, right? And so allostasis is the process by which the body responds to a stressor in order to regain homeostasis. So remember, your body is always wanting to get to its set point. So allostasis basically means achieving stability through change. So if a person gets really hot, right? Remember that our body temperature is 98.6. So that's our homeostatic state. If we get too hot, what happens? We begin to sweat, right? And that's designed to cool us off. So that would be an allostatic response. Does that make sense? Any questions so far? Because I really want to make sure you understand these two terms. All right, because you will see allostasis. Well, some of you might not, because remember, some of the questions get pulled randomly. But allostasis and homeostasis are in the question bank for the exams. All right. So an allostatic load, or also what I call an allostatic state, is the prolonged neurochemical imbalance that has negative consequences for normal neural function. And what this is the body's basically responding to the constant stressor of having drugs added to their system, right? So again, using methamphetamine as an example, right? So, so your body actually physically changes, right? So, and this is really, really important to know. One of the reasons why, I want to make sure I'm not jumping ahead. Sometimes I do that as I talk. One of the reasons why relapse is so prevalent among substance use disorders is because the allostatic state has been in existence for so long that going through withdrawal is very unpleasant. Cravings can be very intense, and people don't want to go through that experience. Certain drugs are worse than others. Like for instance, methamphetamine, you have to crash. Withdrawal isn't that great, right? But it's not as bad as like heroin withdrawal, which can be very painful. But heroin withdrawal will not kill you, whereas alcohol withdrawal will kill you or can kill you if not medically supervised. So that's because your body's trying to return back to its homeostatic state. All right, any questions on allostasis or homeostasis? So allostasis is the body trying to get back to homeostasis, or after prolonged prolonged use, it just becomes the new normal. Whereas homeostasis is where you genetically are your set point. This will come up. We'll talk about it more as we go through. All right, so we were talking about depressants earlier, right? So some of this I've already given away because I jumped ahead when I was talking on that one slide, but depressants are drugs that suppress central nervous system activity, right? You know, they include, you know, alcohol, barbiturates, benzodiazepines, which, by the way, withdrawing from any of these, if you've been using for a very long time, you need to be medically supervised because it is dangerous to withdraw from these depressants here. With alcohol, you know, there's decreased reaction time, decreased visual acuity, you just don't see as well. It lowers levels of alertness. It reduces your behavioral and impulse control. And with enough alcohol can result in a complete loss of consciousness. Can result in a blackout, which is, you know, alcohol-induced amnesia. You're not unconscious, you're up walking around, you're doing things, but the next day you're not going to remember it. And so you'll recognize this channel here if going back to chapter 3, right, when we were talking about action potential and how the sodium ions move into the neuron to activate action potential, right? It moves through these channels. This one is an example of a GABA-gated chloride channel, which is embedded in the cell membrane of certain neurons, not all of them. And it has, what's interesting with this is you'll see that this has several receptor sites, right? So it has GABA receptor site, alcohol can bind to it, benzodiazepines, barbiturates can bind to it. And what that does is that opens the chloride channel, which allows negatively charged chloride ions to enter the cell body, changing its charge in a direction that pushes it away from firing. So this would be an inhibitory response, right? And so what ends up happening is the GABA neuron basically quiets down the brain, right? So that's one example of why this is classified as a depressant. All right, now stimulants increase the overall levels of neural activity. So stimulants are usually dopamine agonists. And who remembers what an agonist is? We talked about it in the last chapter. Who remembers? Your shout out. Nobody?
It keeps the neuron in the channel to keep it so that it goes into the receptor.
It strengthens the effect of the neurotransmitter?
Yes, it strengthens the length of the neurotransmitter. And then the first student that was talking, I'm sorry, I can't see who it was. You are right in the sense that could be an agonist thing that it does, right? That it binds to like a reuptake site so that the neurotransmitter remains in the synaptic gap longer, which is why it would be called an agonist, right? So an agonist is a molecule, or a drug in this case, that basically increases or enhances the strength of the neurotransmitter that it's targeting. So stimulants usually target dopamine. And I kind of told you already that in the last lecture that methamphetamine is one of those that can bind to the receptor because its molecular structure is similar enough to dopamine where the receptor site will receive it. It's like a key in a lock, and activate action potential. The other thing that methamphetamine does is it can also enter the terminal button through the reuptake and actually burst open the vesicles holding the dopamine, which releases a flood of dopamine into the synaptic gap. So it can do it a couple of different ways. Like I said, methamphetamine is a pretty nasty drug. And what's unfortunate with methamphetamine is because it is so powerful, it is extremely addicting. And this is one of the reasons why, right? So dopamine activity is associated with reward and craving. So let's talk about dopamine for a second. Who knows what the purpose of dopamine is in our brain, right? We already know it's a reward, but what's it connected to? Any ideas? What do you guys think?
Feel good, like mood.
Yes, it increases mood, but what activities, what behaviors can we engage in that releases dopamine that will make us want to repeat that behavior?
Pleasure?
Yes, can you be more specific?
Like gratifying?
Sex.
Thank you. I knew somebody was going to say sex. Sex. and
Masturbation.
food. Yes, that's part of sex. Yes, that is true. So sexual activity and eating, right, are two of the natural behaviors that we engage in that releases the most dopamine, right? And the reason why is, and that's connected to the pleasure reward system, is because nature wants us to reproduce, right? To carry on humanity. So you would want that to be rewarding. And also for our own survival. So eating is, when we eat, we release dopamine. So let's just say that having sex releases 300 units, and I'm just throwing out numbers here, so don't say Richard Granstaff said 300 units get released during sex. I'm just throwing out numbers to demonstrate this. But let's say 300 units of dopamine gets released during sexual activity, right? It feels good, we want to do it, and we repeat the behavior, and we have kids and so on, right? Methamphetamine will probably release like 3,000 units. Like, that's how powerful it is. It is off the chart how much dopamine gets released and how much neural activity happens as the result of methamphetamine use, right? But it's also very damaging, and yeah, and it stops working after a while. I know, I've worked with enough clients to know that, right? It also increases strong craving. That's the other thing. So it's extremely highly addictive. Other things with stimulant use is it can mimic psychotic behaviors. People will see things, they will hear things, they will be peeking out their windows looking at shadow people, and all of that is, you know, part of their brain being stimulated, and also sleep deprivation as well impacts that. The other thing, and I think this is what it says in your book, if I'm remembering correctly, it says it in lots of books actually, but one of the issues here is we see some rock cocaine, right? Which is a smokable form of cocaine. And one of the reasons why it made it so addicting was because of its smokable form. So most people consume drugs in one of three ways, right? We either consume it orally, which is the slowest way that it can reach the brain. We can inject it, which is the quickest way to get it into the bloodstream, but doesn't get to the brain as fast as smoking does. Inhalation is actually the fastest way to cross the blood-brain barrier although most people will believe uh, that actually IV use is the quickest way. And the difference is that IV use, you get the full effect, the full dose, whereas smoking, it gets there faster, but you may not get the full dose because some of it's destroyed by combustion. And then it sounds like somebody's unmuted. So is there a question? Can I help there?
No, I was going to say that, Professor, that when you when you use the needle, you just get more of the drug quicker.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. You get more of the drug, but it actually is slower to get to your brain than smoking it. Not by much, but it is slower. So very good. And then a question came in about sex addiction being a form of a stimulant. No, I've never heard it labeled that way, and I've actually never thought about it in that way until this question came across. I look at sex addiction as being like a behavioral compulsion, but yes, it is involved in the release of dopamine, right? And I'm not an expert in sex addiction. I think there's some other mechanics involved, but dopamine release is definitely part of it, right? Definitely part of it. Okay. All right, so here we are talking about dopamine agonists. So remember, an agonist is any substance, right, that enhances the neurotransmitter being targeted. So in this particular case, we're looking at cocaine. And so what cocaine is doing here is cocaine is binding to, oh, let me turn on I'm using my pointer, but you can't see. So we have cocaine right here that is bound. Who knows what this channel is right here? Anybody know? What's that channel?
The reuptake?
That is the reuptake channel, right? And so when the cocaine binds there, it's going to prevent the dopamine from entering, so it cannot be taken up. So what that does is that leaves the dopamine in the synaptic gap longer to activate the next neuron. The other thing cocaine does as an agonist is it is similar enough in shape, so it fits like a key in the lock, to sit on the receptor and act just like the dopamine would act. So it's doing two things, just like the methamphetamine, only the methamphetamine will actually go through the reuptake. It doesn't just sit there. It actually will get its way in there. But this is an example of an agonist. So if it blocks reuptake, it's an agonist. If it sits on the receptor cell and acts like or mimics the neurotransmitter, then it is an agonist. If it sits on the receptor cell and blocks and doesn't act like it, then it's an antagonist. So, so this is a carryover from the previous chapter. So you heard it chapter 3, and you're hearing it again in chapter 4. So any questions on an agonist versus antagonist? All right, very good. All right, so nicotine and caffeine are also stimulants. Actually, caffeine is the world's most widely used stimulant, at least last time I checked. So hopefully my information isn't incorrect, but I believe it is the most widely used. And it increases levels of an alertness. I'm sure I enjoy my cup of coffee every day. But I've actually cut down. I actually only have 1 cup a day now, because you can be diagnosed with a caffeine use disorder, and you can experience caffeine withdrawal, which includes really severe headaches, for example, irritability. Nicotine is also a stimulant, and it interacts with acetylcholine receptors, and it's also very highly addictive. And the thing with acetylcholine receptors is they're at various parts throughout your body as well. So the nicotine can be binding in your brain, but in other areas too. And this also plays a role in arousal and reward. Now come the opioids, which are analgesics, and they're designed to actually decrease pain. Excuse me, sorry. They're also very highly addictive. It includes heroin, morphine, methadone, codeine. Those are probably ones that most people will know. And the thing about opioids is, what's interesting about opioids is using opioids in and of themselves does not really cause a whole lot of damage to the body. As a matter of fact, I'm trying to think here. Actually, I might have a slide on it. So I'll make a statement about it now, and then I think I have a slide later on that kind of demonstrates this. But damage to the body as a result of like opioid use is not that severe, but opioid use has a very high risk of overdose and death because it depresses breathing and causes issues like that. Hold on one second. It looks like I have a question on chat. So I got to turn off my laser pointer. There we go. Sorry, my mouse is not responding well. Yeah, so, yeah, and getting back to, there's a comment about caffeine withdrawal. And what's interesting about the caffeine withdrawal, I'm going to go back to that just for a second. One of the reasons why we get headaches is because our blood vessels inside, in our head, they actually expand. The reason why they're expanding is because they're getting ready for the introduction of caffeine into our system. Stimulants are vasoconstrictors, right? And so what that means is that when you're taking a stimulant, if you're drinking coffee, it's a vasoconstrictor, so it shrinks the veins. It has that effect while it's in the system. Same thing with methamphetamine and cocaine, which is actually quite frustrating to some men, because if they're using meth and they enjoy sex on meth, the vasoconstriction causes erectile dysfunction. And so their libido is really high, but their ability to perform is not so great. And that's because of vasoconstriction. So with caffeine withdrawal, that's what's happening to you in the morning if you haven't had your coffee. And so the blood vessels expand and it creates pain, right? Pressure and pain. So, all right. Hallucinogens are those things that cause changes in our sensory perception. And that's what makes them hallucinogenic, right? And of course, this is variable, right? With regards to the specific transmitters that they affect, different ones for different things, right? So like LSD and mescaline, are serotonin agonists, which means they enhance the effect of serotonin, whereas PCP or ketamine, or AKA Special K, are glutamate receptor antagonists. So in other words, they inhibit the effect of the glutamate. So different mechanisms of actions that are happening here. But basically the result is it alters our perception, and hence the reason for the classification of hallucinogens. All right, so any questions on the classes of drugs? allostasis, homeostasis, definition of substance use disorder. All right. Okay, so now this is what we're going to do. So we're going to talk about stages of change. And one of the reasons why I bring up stages of change is as I throw it into this section with the substance use disorders, because remember earlier I talked about substance use disorders not only being a physiological issue, but it is also a psychological issue, right? And so that's kind of where I want to go right now, is with like people's thoughts, cognitions, their attitudes around their substance use, right? So I work with justice involved individuals. All of them have substance use disorders. All of them, well, for the most part, by the time they get to me, their substance use has progressed to a point where they are definitely in the severe category, right? So they're meeting 6 or more criteria for a substance use disorder, and often they're meeting 10 to 11 of the criteria, right? But some of them don't think that they have a problem, even though I am screening them, interviewing them, and they're handcuffed to a table at George Bailey detention facility, right? But they really do not see their substance use as a problem. So that's the first stage in the stages of change model, also known as the trans-theoretical model of change. And there are 5 stages. So the first stage is pre-contemplation. And so people who are in the pre-contemplation stage of change do not see an issue with the behavior that's in question. So, and where I work, we actually deal with several behaviors. It's not just the substance use disorder, it's also criminal behavior. So they don't see an issue with their criminal behavior. They don't see an issue with their substance using behavior. That's a person who is pre-contemplative. They have no intent on changing anytime in the next 6 months. And actually, to be honest with you, a person can sit in pre-contemplation for years, right? They can sit there for years. Now, interestingly too, and this may sound counterintuitive, a person can be pre-contemplative and still realize that they're having issues, but they're going to blame it on something else. They're going to find some other reason why they're in the trouble that they're in, right? I had one guy tell me during the screening, he said, yeah, the only reason why I'm here is because you know, I used my heroin and I nodded off, which I was supposed to be doing, and he was supposed to be driving, and he pulled over and used and nodded off, and we both got caught. A very pre-contemplative statement, right? Like, my heroin use was not the problem. If my buddy hadn't used, he was not supposed to use, I would not be sitting here in jail, right? So definitely not seeing an issue, right? The next stage is contemplation. And what's really important with contemplation, how you know a person is in contemplation, is because of the way they're speaking, their narrative. There's aspects of ambivalence. In other words, they're sitting on the fence. They know they have a problem. They can see the consequences of it. They might even go, you know, I really should try to make some changes, but I don't want to. I really think I want to keep doing this, right? So they're doing some sustained talk, in other words, staying in the problem, and they're doing some change talk, which is, yeah, I can see the benefit of changing. I might want to do it, but they're just sitting on the fence. They're thinking about it, and maybe they have an intention to maybe change in the next 6 months, right? But it's still kind of up in the air. They're on the fence. The next stage is known as preparation stage. And in this stage, people have made a commitment to change within the next 30 days. So in other words, they've resolved that ambivalence. They've moved out of the contemplation stage of change. And they're saying, okay, I recognize I got these problems. This really sucks. I need to make a change. And that person might begin making changes, right? I mean, plans to change. So maybe if they're an alcoholic, for instance, maybe they call up the local AA central office or Google AA meetings, and they'll go, oh, there's a meeting by my house. Okay, maybe I'll check that out in the next month, right? So this is a person who's investigating things. They might even make some small steps toward the behavior change. They might try out some strategies and look for some resources, right? Like calling AA central office, for example. So that's a person in preparation. The next stage is action. And in the action stage of change, this person has made overt changes that are perceptible, right? But they've been doing it for less than 6 months. They start going to meetings. Maybe they haven't stopped drinking all the way, but they've cut back severely, like a lot, right? Maybe they pick up a sponsor. Maybe they actually set a quit date and they do it, right? So this is a person who is in action stage of change. And then the last stage of change is maintenance. And in the maintenance stage of change, they've engaged in their plans. It's becoming routine. They are actually doing things in order to prevent relapse, right? They're building a structure in their life that kind of insulates them from relapse. They're making maybe new friends. They get a sponsor. They start working steps. Maybe they go to an outpatient treatment program, get involved in that, and they're doing that. And that might carry over from action as well. A person in action might do that same thing. But in maintenance, they've been doing it for at least 6 months. And people in this stage usually report the highest levels of self-efficacy and are less frequently tempted to relapse. In other words, there are some real internal changes that have been occurring within this individual that is taking them further and further away from using. So those are the 5 stages of change. Sometimes you will hear, and I hear this among, it's funny, we were having this discussion where I worked the other day with a new counselor, and she said, oh, no, I was told there were 6 stages of change. I'm like, no, there are 5 stages of change. Relapse is not a stage of change in the trans-theoretical model of change. Relapse is a situation where a person begins to use again, if we're talking about drugs, or they return to a previous behavior and a previous lifestyle, and they kind of continue on with that. There's no change happening there. They've returned to what they were doing. So that is not a stage of change. And then on some stage of change models, if you Google it, you'll also see number 6 as termination. Some places you don't see it as termination as stage 6, other places you do. But for the purposes of my class, and if you work in my center, there are 5 stages of change, and I kind of insist on that. Termination is also an event. It's not a stage. And a person terminates the stages of change once they've completed and gone through maintenance, and they just have a new life. There is no more changing happening. So the stages of change have ended because they've gone from their old lifestyle to their new lifestyle. So relapse and termination are not stages of change. So any questions on that?
I have a question.
Yes.
Why is it so common for relapse to be in the stages of change?
Relapse is not in the stages of change, and that's what I'm trying to emphasize.
But
Relapse,
why
wait,
is it
hold on.
so, I've seen this before. and-
Hold on 1 second. Hold on,
Yeah, go ahead.
because I know where you're going.
Yeah, go ahead.
So relapse is the result of a substance use disorder. So remember, the other thing about a substance use disorder is, I believe the SAMHSA definition of substance use disorder includes a chronic, progressive, relapsing disease. So relapse is a part of having a substance use disorder. So that's where relapse comes in. The other thing I want to stress about relapse for those AOD counselors in here, and I know we have about 5 or future, people that work in the field already. There is a difference between relapse and lapse, right? Relapse is one of those terms that gets thrown around the 12-step rooms, the recovery rooms. Any use is a relapse. And clinically speaking, that's absolutely not true. So, for example, I'm working with a guy right now who came in for meth. He also has alcohol issues, alcohol use disorder. And he recently tested positive for alcohol use, right? And so when I was talking with him and working with him about that, he said, yeah, he said, I meant to come in and tell you about it. He said, I had the drink. I knew as soon as it happened, that I had made a mistake, right? So what happened there, and this is words are important. What happened there is he had a recurrence of alcohol consumption. He had a drink. He did not relapse because he did not continue drinking. Relapse is a continuation, a return to that previous behavior. So he had a recurrence, a lapse. He called his sponsor. He told his sponsor about it right away. Now, unfortunately, he didn't come in and tell us because we're drug court and he was worried about going to jail. So that kind of prevented him from doing that. But all the other aspects of what he did indicate that he kind of came right back in. So sometimes you can see the stages of change demonstrated in a circle. And unfortunately, I don't have it in this particular slide. I might add this to it because the visual can be very helpful. But imagine a circle where the stages of change are arranged around the circle, and a relapse is an arrow going off the circle. So a person that relapses leaves the stages of change. They stop changing, right? They go back into their substance use. A person that has a recurrence, right, may not be considered as leaving the stage of change because it's not a relapse. He might come back in at a, let's see if I can turn on my laser pointer. So let's just say that he was in this area of the stages of change, right? He's down here, he has his drink. Maybe he's struggling a little bit. Maybe he did drop back into contemplation a little bit, thinking, oh, I can get away with it just once. That's really kind of like a contemplation stage of thinking. And if you'll notice over here, I have a comment that people move in and out of the stages, sometimes repeatedly. They can also go back and forth through the stages. So a person can move from contemplation to preparation to action and then slide backwards again, right? It may not result in a recurrence of use, but they can, this isn't just unidirectional. It can go both ways. So So Eduardo, I'm sorry I cut you off a little bit because I thought I knew where you were going. Did I, and I wanted to finish my thought also. Oops. Did I answer your question?
I was just getting to the point. Why is it so common that never mind. Yeah, I see. The way I was taught was the circle,
Yeah,
and then yeah, but then okay, I get it.
yeah. And so remember on the circle, the way you were taught, relapse usually is shown off the circle, isn't it? And there's usually like a little arrow going.
It would go back to pre-contemplation, but okay, I never
Yeah,
liked that. I never liked that model. You know, the circle model.
yeah, because you don't necessarily.
It kind of makes it seem like a cycle more than like a stage of change. You know, this makes it more clear.
Yeah,
And
yeah, and that's why I kind of like using it this way. But sometimes the circle can be helpful for other students, but I just haven't put it in this. The other thing I'll say is you're right. It does make it look like a cycle, right? And ideally, a person who goes through, who successfully navigates all 5 stages of change would end up at termination and be done. But just because a person has a recurrence or even a full-on relapse, in other words, they return to the behavior for a while, when they come back into the stage of change, they don't necessarily come back at pre-contemplation. They could come in at preparation. So it is not true that because a person relapses, they come back at pre-contemplation. That's not true. They can come back in at a further along in the stages. And the reason why is based on their previous experience. Remember, one thing with substance use disorders, SAMHSA put out a study a couple of years ago that showed that on average, it takes a person 7 treatment episodes before they actually are successfully able to terminate the stages of change and actually have a different lifestyle. 7 times. So, but with each time that somebody tries it, they're getting closer and closer to that goal of abstinence or behavior change, right? So that's why I'm saying just because a person relapses, they don't automatically come back into pre-contemplation. Maybe early on, maybe they do, but if they've had several episodes behind them and they've got some recovery experience or some treatment experience, they may come in at preparation and go, you know what, that relapse, that was awful. I never want to do that again. I've learned my lesson. I got to figure out what I missed. So they're coming in at a much higher stage of change. Does that make sense? And I know I'm kind of talking to you, Eduardo, but it's really for everybody.
I've seen it happen before. They either jump into contemplation or even action. You know, they'll start going to meetings.
Yeah, they jump right back in. Exactly.
That's true.
They jump right back in. Right. Okay, so I had a question come up that says, is recurrence more popular than relapse? So I'm going to make an exception. No, I don't want to make an assumption of what you meant by most popular, more popular. Can you rephrase the question in a different way?
I just meant that it seems like from my experiences that more people relapse and just have a short, like one quick little mistake. It seems like most people fall back into relapse. Seems like in my experience, it seems like that happens more than the reoccurrence. So I was just wondering if you knew if that reoccurrence happened more than the relapse, because from what more relapse than recurrence.
Yeah. So more prevalent than relapse. So is recurrent more prevalent than relapse?
Right.
And I don't know. I don't have any statistics behind it. And it sounds like what you're talking about right now is your anecdotal experience. I have my anecdotal experience that would say that, for me, it's like 50-50, to be honest. But again, it's anecdotal. I would love to see a study, and I'll bet somebody's done it, on, I just haven't looked for it, on lapse versus relapse, right?
Right.
The other thing about relapse too, and clinically speaking, a person can't be considered to have relapsed if they have not been engaged in a behavior change for more than 6 months or less than 6 months. Wait, am I saying that right? Hold on. In other words, the behavior change has to have occurred for a certain length of time clinically, right? So, so if they're in early remission, for instance, which happens at 3 months of a substance use disorder abstinence, if they're in early remission up to about 6 months, you may be able to consider that a relapse. Anything prior to that, there hasn't been enough change. There was only a cessation of use, but no other changes really. And so that might be just considered continued use with a break in between, if that makes sense. So, so for the AOD students or anyone familiar with recovery or 12-step philosophy, you really have to separate what relapse means in the rooms versus what relapse, lapse, and recurrence mean clinically for our clients. So, all right. Any other questions on the stages of change?
Are the stages of change specific to substance use or just any behavior?
So that's an excellent question. Initially, when the stages of change were first being kind of formulated by Prochaska and DiClemente, it was focused on substance use, right? But it is actually applicable to any behavior change that you might want to go to, right? So I want to change my diet, right? Or I want to get healthier, or I want to start working out, or I want to start going hiking, right? The stages of change apply to any behavior change that we want to engage in. So it's a great question. And here's the other thing about stages of change. Depending on the subject, right? You might be in one stage of change for going to the gym and a different stage of change for eating healthier. So a person that might be going to the gym every day and they're in action, they're in the action stage of change for going to the gym and working out, but they're coming home and they're killing a half a sheet of cake, right? So they're in contemplation or pre-contemplation for eating better, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
All right, and let's see here. Any other questions? All right, so I got one coming through the chat. Oh, the National Academy of Sports Medicine uses stages of change model in their curriculum to teach personal trainers how to understand and motivate clients. And that's beautiful. And here's why. The other reason why stages of change, and I wasn't going to get too much into it right now for tonight, but I will make a brief mention of it. And thank you for that comment and allowing me to share that with the class, is that assessing a person's stages of change is important if you're working with them, because you have to use the correct interventions for the correct stage in order for it to be effective. So for example, if I'm working with a person who is smoking and he tells me, I have no intention on smoking. I know you guys don't like it that I smoke. I have no intention of stopping smoking. Just forget about it. And I put him in a nicotine cessation relapse prevention class. That is a total mismatch. That person is not ready for it. And what are they going to do? They're going to be disruptive. They're going to buck against the system. It's going to push them away. It might push them deeper into their pre-contemplation. They're going to dig their heels in. So it's really important to understand where a person is in their stage of change so that you're using the correct intervention so that you don't drive them deeper into the behavior that that would be beneficial for them to change. So, and we'll talk more about that in the therapy chapter, because that's when I would have hit on this again. But that's why it's important to know what stage of change a person is in. All right, so are we ready to do our group exercise thing? So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna show you two videos here. They're two music videos. I hope you enjoy it. And what I want you to do for each video is just pull out a piece of paper and just kind of jot down some notes on what you think, what stage of change you think the person that's being highlighted in the video is engaged in. Like, what's the content of the song that might be? What's the look on their face? What are they presenting? Do they think they have a problem? Do they are they engaging? Do they want to engage in any behavior change? What is it that you're seeing? So that's kind of what I want you to kind of like jot down. And then after we watch both videos, I'm going to put you guys into breakout rooms, and you guys can talk about it as a group. And each group will elect a spokesperson. And I'll be honest, we may not get through all the groups, but I want to do this exercise so that you kind of like have a little bit of hands-on, and then we'll come back together and talk about it. Now, before I do that, I had another question that came in. It was a great question that says, does this tie in with using SMART goal templates? Yes, with stages of change, you do want to use SMART goal templates. Matching that intervention, seeing what their motivations are, and then using their motivations to create their SMART goals, which for those that don't know, SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable or achievable. I've seen it both ways. Relevant or rewarding. I've seen it both ways there. And time bound. So in other words, you have a goal that the following week you can say, yes, I did this. Here's the evidence that I did it, and look what happened, right? So yes, SMART goals, very important for that. All right. So any questions on getting back to the group exercise we're going to do? Any questions on that? All right, so pull out a piece of paper, jot down what you think, and let's go to the first video. Oh, first let me pause for a second. All right, so here is the first song. It's a cover, by the way. All right, so that has a lot of imagery in it. There's a lot of stuff going on. But I want you to just kind of think about it for a second. Maybe you've been jotting down some notes. Some of you may not know the story of Johnny Cash, but he definitely had some substance use issues throughout his life, and which he worked on. Well, he worked on for a very, very long time. So some things that he talks about, right? Like the needle tears a hole. He's talking about a lot of regret. He's talking about a lot of behaviors that he had engaged in, right? So just be thinking about that when you're thinking about what possible stage of change he might be in, okay? All right, now we're gonna move to the second song. And again, same thing, take some notes, listen, enjoy. And some of you might recognize her already. All right. So jot down some notes from that as well. I tell you, every time I play this one, I mean, watching her video really makes me sad. Uh, who knows what happened to Amy Winehouse? I'm sure people do.
Indeed.
Overdose.
Yeah, she died, and such a waste of talent, such a young life, and died as the result of experiencing her own struggles with a substance use disorder. And it's really, really quite sad. So, all right, so jot down your notes. I am going to pause the recording because we're going to all righty, so we've come back from our groups and we've had our discussion. That was an awesome, awesome, lively discussion. You guys did a great job. I'm just going to kind of back it up here, back to the stages of change, and just kind of wrap up, right? So in the two videos, you know, Johnny Cash, that video is a little bit complex. You guys did a great job with that, right? Some people said contemplation stage of change, and there's certainly some arguments that could be made for that. And then I liked how one of the students pointed out at the very end of the song, he says, I will find a way, right? And that may have been indicative of him either, you know, resolving his ambivalence, moving into preparation, moving into the action stage of change. So great job on that. And then Amy Winehouse, of course, definitely everyone was in agreement that she was demonstrating the pre-contemplation stage of change, although there was some aspects of some change talk, like, you know, the line that says, you know, I don't want to drink anymore, but I still need my friend, like referring to her other substance use issues. You know, and Amy struggled for a long time, and this song kind of goes along with her story, and it's a sad it's a sad case. But you guys did a great job. I would agree, pre-contemplation throughout most of that song, right? They try to send me to rehab and I won't go, no, no, no. She was able to recognize some issues, but even with that, was just not ready to change her behavior. And sadly, as we know the story, it ended up killing her. So, all right, so that's it for tonight. You guys have been great. Class is dismissed, and you all have a very nice evening.